All right, good morning, everyone. I hope everyone's doing well today. It's Friday, so that's exciting. Does anybody have any questions before we get started? Is anybody brand new? Let me ask that first. Nobody added this class recently? We're all good? Okay, very good. Okay. So what we're going to do today, we are going to finish our first lecture. Then I'll pull up the syllabus and we'll kind of go over what's going to happen next week and perhaps the week after that. That way you guys can, you can keep it straight, and me too, because I'm teaching multiple classes. So we'll just all get on the same page. All right. Any questions before we get started? All righty. Let me get the lecture up and going. Okay. All right, will you guys give me a thumbs up? You can see this straight? Y'all see it? Okay, great. Okay, so let's just kind of briefly go over what we went over on Wednesday, and then we'll pick up where we left off. So what we're going over this week are the crime trends and how corrections sort of assimilated based on those crime trend changes. So we started by looking at the post-war crime trends. So the early period from about 1946 to the 60s, we had stable low crime rates that you can see a little bit right here. Just imagine that it went straight across like that. The middle period was from the 60s to the 70s. That was rapidly accelerating crime rates that you can see right here. The late period, which is where we are now, we classify as stable high crime rates with a slow decline. Like I said, even though we see this drop right here, which we're going to talk about at the end of class, consider like when we're comparing it to where we were in the early period, it's pretty high. And then just to give it a little bit of context where we are today, you can see that slow decline that I was talking about. And when we look at the crime trends from the late 1990s until about 2016, you can see that even after the Great American Crime Decline of the 90s, we've continued to go down since then. And like I said, at the end of class today, we're going to talk about the Great American Crime Decline. So again, don't let anybody try to tell you crime rates are rising, because they're not. Been going down since the 90s. All right, so then we talked about how sentencing dealt with that. So up until the 1970s, we sentenced offenders in an indeterminate way. This is what we kind of referred to as the rehabilitative ideal, because the point of this was to give the offenders a range of time and to release them once they showed evidence of rehabilitation. So the judges had wide discretion. They could sentence offenders pretty much at will. And then the Department of Corrections would determine through the parole board when they get released, when they were given that range by the judges. And like I said, the parole board was supposed to release them when they showed evidence of rehabilitation. Around the 1970s, everything changed. We saw the crime rates rising, the Attica riot, the Kansas City preventative patrol experiment, Martin's Nothing Works. Even though it was called What Works, everybody refers to it as Nothing Works. And because of that, we switched the way we sentenced offenders. So we moved away from the rehabilitative ideal into the justice model, and we took away the discretion of those judges, and we were sentencing offenders to mandatory minimums, and we did away with parole. So sorry if you can hear my son down there. So we would give everybody like one big sentence, and then truth in sentencing said you had to serve at least 85%. You could shave off that last 15%, but because of that, we didn't need parole anymore. So parole release was eliminated. This is when we also started to see intermediate sanctions pop up, and we're going to talk about how our new era has sort of changed the way we use those intermediate sanctions. So let's get to where we are today. So one thing I do want to note, so the rehabilitative ideal and the justice model are all about the way that we sentence offenders, right? When I talk about new penology, that's less about how we're sentencing offenders and more how the Department of Corrections and how correctional officials are dealing with the backlash of what happened during the justice model, all right? So as the justice model took over sentencing practices, there was obviously an increase in the number of prisoners throughout the nation, as you can see from these two graphs. So I apologize in advance. I know the colors are the same on the graphs, but the colors don't mean the same thing in each graph. So we'll go through. So the first one here, the blue is male, the green is female, and the red is just the average incarceration rate. So you can see right here, this is the mid-70s right here. So the justice model policies took over in the mid-70s, and look what happened to the incarceration rate after that. And this graph ends in 2006, and this one picks up 2000 to 2016. And in this graph, the red are the state prisoners, the green are the local jails, and the blue are the federal prisoners. So what you can see right here, so we had a huge increase in the 70s all the way up. We hit a peak around 2008, 2010, and we have seen the steadiest, the slowest little decline in the incarceration rate since then. But it has not changed a whole lot because we haven't done a whole lot about the way we sentence offenders. New penology is just about how the Department of Corrections are dealing with this large increase in incarcerations. So I'm sure you've heard through the news, like over the last 5 or 10 years or so, criminal justice reform has been a huge hot topic. This is why, because the policies of the justice model had a huge effect on our incarceration rate. So let's talk about how that sort of manifested itself with the people that are actually running these prisons. So as the prison population began to grow rapidly, there began to be a shift away from the traditional concerns of the individual to the concerns of the aggregate. So let me explain. First of all, does anybody know what the term aggregate means? Have we heard this word before? Who wants to tell me what it means?
It's like the summation of all the parts. It's the totality.
Very well said, yes. So the example I like to give is if we were in the classroom together and there wasn't a plague, I could ask the classroom to disaggregate by gender. So we would have what, like 3, 4 girls maybe on one side of the room and all the males on the other. If I wanted to aggregate you back, we would have everybody together. So what we're seeing here, imagine you are, so just briefly, let me back up. Anytime you go into an incarcerated setting, one of the first things you do is meet with an intake officer who does kind of a brief interview with you to figure out where in the prison you should be housed, right? So things they want to know are you affiliated with a gang? If so, which gang? Because we don't want to be putting Bloods and Crips together. Something that every intake officer always asks, do you have any enemies? Which these people, I mean, people that are incarcerated constantly have enemies. Yes, Patrick.
So they do that like as you get to the prison. They don't like have that selected like when you're sentenced.
Mm-hmm. Well, so there's 2 types of custody that we're gonna, let me just skip ahead to custody right here.
Sorry.
So there's 2 types of custody. The first thing is, are you going to a minimum, medium, max, or supermax prison? But then once you get into that prison, you meet with an intake officer to determine where in the prison you're gonna be. Does that make sense?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Yeah. So I think, Patrick, you, maybe Sam, a few of you may have gone on the jail tour with me back when we could do that before the plague. Yeah, so that was like the second room we went into. The first room is where they do like the cavity search and they'll fingerprint you and all that stuff. And then you go in and meet with your intake officer.
Barking at us.
Yes. Well, actually, at the Alcannon Detention Center here in town, what they do is they have you meet with a webcam with the judge first, because if you can get bonded out, then they won't even book you into the jail. So you only need to meet with an intake officer if you're actually getting booked into the jail. So those of you that have gone on the jail tour, and I take you through that room where all the people that are having like the worst day of their life are sitting, and I'm like, please don't stare at them. Those are people that are waiting to meet with the judge, or are waiting for somebody to post their bond, or are waiting to speak to the intake officer before they're actually booked into the jail. So what shifted here when we have that many prisoners, those intake interviews had to be quick, right? So instead of being able to sit down and get this person's life story to figure out, you know, where in the jail they would fit best as well, or if they're incarcerated in a state or a federal prison, we also want to know, do you want to be in any sort of rehabilitation program, right? So prior to all of this, those interviews could be really long, but when you have too many people coming in, they have to be quick, right? And so when you meet with an intake officer, they're looking at a computer screen and they're rapid fire asking you questions: age, race, what's your birth date, so they can pull your record, right? And what they do here is, instead of individually looking at you as a person, they just sort of take this information and it kind of becomes risk factors, right? And what the computer can do is, if you hit too many risk factors, it'll say, hey, this person needs to be in a more of a lockdown wing, right? Or you can't put this person in this wing because they've got an enemy in here, right? So you can use these sort of computer systems and statistical methods to be able to quickly pick who goes where, instead of, so the intake interviews changed completely. So that's what I mean when I say a shift from individual concerns to the aggregate, right? So we can't look at you as an individual. We are now looking at you as a group of risk factors, right? So maybe Sam has 3 risk factors, Zach has 2. Somebody that has 3 risk factors goes in this wing. Somebody that has 2 goes in this wing, right? So you're no longer Sam and Zach, you are risk factors, right? And that's what I mean when we're shifting from the individual to the aggregate. So the main concern here was just sort of managing the aggregates of dangerous groups within the prisons, right? So when you meet with that intake officer, it will spit out if you are somebody that might need to be watched more closely, right? So we're going to watch you based on these risk factors instead of this individual interview that we were able to do before. So this strategy really took deviance as a given, right? So as a result, the concern is no longer how to intervene or respond to individual deviance, but just how to regulate the levels of deviance, right? So whereas they used to have maybe 4 or 5 troublemakers in a prison, now they've got 4 or 5 groups of 10, right? So we've grouped you into groups of 10 based on, you know, your risk factors. So we need to watch these 10 people, or, you know, because you have these risk factors, you're more likely to participate in violence if we put you in this wing, right? So this strategy, with this new concern came several implications. One, the increased reliance on imprisonment, as you can see right here, and then the concerns for surveillance and custody. So custody, like I was just saying, we want to meet with your intake officer and it's going to tell you what custody level you are. So every state does custody levels a little bit different, and usually the local jails do it their own way, and then the state prisons are all the same. So for instance, in our local jail, we have 3 levels. There's, and I could be wrong about this, I think the blue is the low level, the green is the medium. Oh, there's 4 levels. The black and white are the dangerous, and the red are the mentally unstable. So based on the score that is spit out, when you go to that intake officer, it will determine what color uniform you go, which then determines what wing you go to. So that's more about the custody right there. And the surveillance is, if you are a black and white or a red jumpsuit, we're going to watch you more closely because you're high risk. All right, so let's talk about the specific policies of new penology. So this new objective, this main objective here, is the efficient control of internal system processes. So it's no longer about punishing and rehabilitating offenders. It's about identifying and managing unruly groups, right? So the goal is not to eliminate crime in the institution. We're just trying to make it tolerable through systematic coordination. And that's what I meant when I said that it took deviance as a given, right? So previous to this, in a minimum security prison, you may only have like 1 or 2 unruly inmates. Now you've got 20 or 30, right? So we know we can't keep prison violence at a 0. We're just trying to keep it as low as possible through this efficiently moving people around based on risk levels. So This new objective manifested itself in several ways. The first one is the advancement of statistical methods. So just like I was saying, if you are going to use a computer system to calculate risk levels, you need statistics to be able to do that. So a perfect example of this, and I'll go right into this next, more cost-efficient forms of custody. A lot of the ways the incarcerated settings dealt with making it more cost efficient was to use statistical methods. So a perfect example, when I worked at Florida State as a grad student, we got a contract with the Department of Corrections in Florida, and they wanted us to create a system that would flag when either a region of prisons in Florida, a specific prison, or a specific wing within a prison was reaching an escalated level that might lead to violence. So myself and several other researchers went in there and did all the statistical coding. And the way it works is that every time you make a report in the system, it goes into this algorithm, right? So if there's one wing of a prison that got like 4 violent reports that day, if you look at the map that this created, that wing will be bright red, right? So every morning the warden can look and see if there's one area that looks like it's troublesome, right? And then they can go talk to the correctional officers and find out, you know, like, hey, it looks like violence might be brewing in this area. Maybe we want to make sure that we can separate some of these members. Like, are there 2 people that keep getting in fights? Can we separate them? Is there something we can do to bring this down? It would go green, yellow, red, right? So you want to see your whole prison in green, right? So you could, the person in charge of the Department of Corrections in Florida could look and see if one region is problematic, one prison is problematic, or even parts of that prison. So that's a more cost-efficient form of custody through using statistical methods. So this is what we started to see with a lot of these prisons, because too many people were coming in and they couldn't spend the time individually interviewing people. They had to do these quick intakes that would tell you where to go somewhere and can also let someone know if it looks like there's a lot of violence in your area. So another way that they were dealing with more cost-efficient forms of custody, this is when we really started to see electronic monitoring be used for more than just low-risk offenders. So electronic monitoring used to just be for like first-time DUIs, sometimes maybe second DUI, but now we're starting to see it for high-risk offenders that are on probation or parole. So in the state of California, any sex offender, I think you have to be a high-risk sex offender, and they're using a statistical method to tell us if you reach that threshold. When you get released on parole, you're on electronic monitoring for life. But other states are doing similar things where they're saying, instead of bringing these people into the prison, we're going to see if we can just keep them on electronic monitoring at home. So this goes right into this one right here as well. So we're trying to have expanded and more efficient uses of incapacitation. We're trying to use selective incapacitation. So selective incapacitation is trying to choose the worst of the worst that go into prisons, right? Collective incapacitation is the opposite. A perfect example of a collective incapacitation strategy is a mandatory minimum, right? So it doesn't matter. So this is when we switched to the justice model and took the discretion away from the judges. If you were convicted of this offense, their hands are tied. You automatically are going away for this amount of time. That is collective incapacitation. Selective would be able to go in and say, I think this person may not need to be incarcerated. So they're trying to use selective incapacitation and electronic monitoring to keep people from coming in or to get more people out and put them on electronic monitoring. So the other thing that we saw change here, if we're trying to use selective incapacitation and trying to maybe put more people on intermediate sanctions instead of putting them in prison. So we have this huge number of people coming into prison, right? And they're like, oh man, we got too many people coming in. Let's try to shift some of them to probation or parole, right? The same thing happened to probation and parole. So just like we were seeing overcrowding in prison, About 10 years later, we saw the same problem with probation and parole. So now probation and parole officers, I think their average caseload is about 70, which means they have 70 offenders to watch over for at any given time. So the same thing that happened in the Department of Corrections happened in community corrections. So just like the Department of Corrections used to look at you individually, now they don't have time to do that. Same thing happened with probation and parole, right? So the way that they did these intermediate sanctions kind of shifted focus away from trying to help this offender get back on their feet or to maintain a life that is crime-free. It's now just about trying to keep tabs on them because there are too many offenders to watch. So let me field a question to you guys. If we have a property offender, do you think they need to be on drug tests? What do we think?
I mean, were they found like there's been situations in my town where there was a property offense, but the guy was higher than a freaking kite on meth. So, I mean, there'd be a drug offense as well. So,
okay, so if he had a drug offense, that makes sense. But if we've got somebody that is arrested for burglary, only burglary, do we need to have them on drug tests?
it wouldn't seem logical to do so.
Exactly, right? Another question. So if we have a drug offender, right, should we just drug test them every week, or should we drug test them every week and get them treatment? What is drug testing every week going to do without treatment?
Yeah, like every week and then treatment would be productive.
Right. In a perfect world, that would work, right? But we don't have the offenders or the probation officers don't have that time to call around to these agencies and find a spot that will take an offender for treatment. Takes a lot of time. What is quick and easy, and an easy way to keep tabs on these offenders is say, everybody, I don't care what offense you were convicted of, or if you have a drug problem or not, everybody's got to take drug tests every week. That means that as a probation officer, I just get an email if one of my offenders pops, right? And I'm not trying to say probation and parole officers are lazy. That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm saying they're doing the best they can because they have too many people to watch over, right? So we started to see intermediate sanctions shift their focus away from trying to help these offenders become rehabilitated and more just on surveillance and control because there are too many of them. So surveillance and control, that is drug test without treatment, or surveillance and control, that is a drug test for an offender that has nothing to do with drugs, right? But that's an easy way to control their movements and to keep tabs on them without them having to actually do anything. Again, I'm not saying they're lazy. I'm saying they're dealing with overcrowding in their particular area. It's just, and sometimes their hands are tied. Sometimes states will pass laws that say every offender gets drug tests, random drug tests every 2 months, and their hands are kind of tied. But it's the government's way of trying to help them with their job. So I used to have a whole lecture on this when I taught at Florida State, but I'll just give you a basic overview. Traditionally, when the office of, or when probation and parole officers first started, most of them were social workers. They went to college for social work and they wanted to be probation and parole officers to help people. They didn't carry guns. They weren't doing drug tests. They were trying to get them treatment. They were trying to help them get jobs, GEDs, get better housing, get their kids out of foster care, whatever. That was the point, but it shifted. When we sort of shifted everything and they had too many people to watch and the whole system shifted towards surveillance and control, all of a sudden we're seeing that job change. Now probation and parole officers carry guns. A lot of them have desks set up in police departments and will actively participate with the police. So perfect example, if you're on parole, a parole officer is allowed to go into your house and search without a warrant. If you're an officer, you need probable cause for that warrant. But if you're trying to get in that person's house, you could say, hey, is this one of your parolees? Would you mind conducting a search, right? That right there is not helping this person. That is surveillance and control. We have started to see this position shift away from social work help into law enforcement surveillance and control. So with all of this, we saw distinct changes when we look at the effect of drugs and punishment. So the emphasis isn't on treatment here, it's on trying to use drug use as a risk indicator or a way to kind of keep tabs on this person. So we see a lot of emphasis on drug testing and not drug treatment. And like I said, it sort of uses, the probation and parole officers are using this as a reason to keep tabs on someone, even if they're not a drug addict. So as a result, the incarceration for drug offenses grew twice the rate of other offenses during the period of 1976 through 1984. But really, if you want to boil down all of the policies of new penology, it's efficiency through the use of statistics, because there are just too many offenders for us to watch individually. I can't look at each individual person. I have to look at a group of risk level 1, risk level 2, risk level 3. What works best for people with these risk factors versus these versus these. All right, so questions about this? Very good. Okay, just quickly, rehabilitative ideal and the justice model, all about sentencing, new penology. What do we do with this large population now that the justice model has increased the population so large? Hampton, did you have a question?
Yes, ma'am. I was waiting until you were done. I was going to ask, since you say a lot of inmates come in and out, like on a weekly basis, how many do you think would go into prison and come out of prison?
Okay, so if you're asking about jail versus state versus federal, those numbers change considerably.
State.
State prisons, 700,000 people are released from state prison like every couple of weeks.
Wow.
Yeah. So, and local jails are, I mean, it's astronomical how many people come in and out of those jails. All right. So now we're going to kind of switch gears a little bit, and we're going to talk about the Great American Crime Decline. So let's start by taking a look at the stats a little bit. So you can see the decline here from this chart goes from 93 to 2011, and this one goes from the 60s to 2012. So you can see just kind of the Great American Crime Decline right here. You can see how it decreased. We've got the violent crime in the blue and the property crime in the red. And then when you look in the context right here, this is the Great American Crime Decline right here, and we've only continued to go down since then. So between the 90s and the early 2000s, all 7 of the FBI's index offenses decreased. So I'm going to rattle off a bunch of numbers. You don't have to write these down. I just want you to hear how much they decreased. So homicide went down by 39%, rape went down by 41%, robbery by 44%, aggravated assault 24%, burglary 41%, auto theft 37%, and larceny 23%. That is a large amount. We rarely see numbers like that. Usually it's a lot more gradual than that, but this is a steep, steep decline. And as you might understand, that really piqued researchers and policymakers' interest, right? We want to know what was happening during that period. But what's important to note here is, so this comes from the FBI. This is the Department of Justice. So these are crimes reported to the police. So what are we missing? It looks like people are
The unreported crimes.
Yeah, exactly. Because we need to confirm if the victim surveys look the same. If not, it's not that crime's going down, right? It's just that less people are reporting crime, right? So let's take a look with the victim surveys. So this is decrease right here. So the Bureau of Justice Statistics right here, and which is the victim surveys, and the UCR, these are reported crimes in the blue. So you can see right here that this trend is substantially confirmed. But not only that, what we also see here is that they move the larceny and the aggravated assault much closer to the average. Remember, aggravated assault and larceny only went down by like 20-something% when everything else was like 30 to 40. When you look at the victim surveys, we see that also moves that trend a little bit closer to where everybody else was. So we can confirm that it is, in fact, crime is going down. It's not just more or less people are reporting crimes, right? So something else that's important to point out when you look at this is it's a gradual decline. It's not like a huge sharp turn, like we keep seeing it go down incrementally, which makes it a lot harder to pinpoint a single cause for that decline. All right, so let's talk about what caused this. So before we can determine what caused it, we need to start by looking at the historical context. So Martinson's Nothing Works, the Kansas City experiment, all of that kind of stuff, plus the crime rates, it was just sort of this atmosphere of discouragement that indicated that it seems like whatever we were doing wasn't working well, right? So basically what happened here is it kind of created an overreaction, and the justice model was that overreaction because of all those things coalescing at once. Our nation said, that's it, we've had enough. And they said that the justice model was kind of a bit of an overreaction. So after people started to see that decline in the early 90s, they saw that it was starting to go down. Sort of the race was on to point the finger at what caused it. And we started to, all of these independent states or cities were coming up and saying, my policies are the reason why the crime rate is declining. So this is what researchers started to refer to as the favorite son narrative. So what we're seeing here is in New York City, their broken windows policies, they were saying that's the reason why the crime rate's declining. Then California, they were saying it's the tough sentencing laws, right? The 3 strikes are out. So everybody was saying it's my policy, it's my policy. We started referring to it as the favorite son, right? But none of it makes any sense because it was a nationwide trend. So California's policies shouldn't affect the nation, or New York City's broken windows, that shouldn't affect the nation, right? So a term I want to introduce you to is the euphoric fallacy. So the euphoric fallacy is the temptation to assume that crime declines are caused by policy. So all of these people, I'll say it again in a second, all of these people that were coming up saying it was my policy that caused this crime decline were committing the euphoric fallacy, which is the temptation to assume that crime declines are caused by policy. So one of the things that I get asked this question a lot, like, you know, would this change the crime rate? Would this do, why doesn't this policy affect it? Crime is a social problem, and rarely is one policy going to affect the nationwide crime rate, which is why I'm teaching you about the euphoric fallacy. So let's talk about what did cause the Great American Crime Decline. Now, I've broken it down into 3 parts. Keep in mind, there's probably about 40 other parts that go into this that are unnecessary for an undergrad education. Should you want to continue in your studies of criminal justice, you'll learn about a lot of other things that go into this as well. But these were some of the big 3 right here. So let's start with incarceration. So there was a huge increase in incarceration starting in the 70s, like we just saw, right? But if you're going to look at the effect of incarceration on crime, there's 2 effects this can have. 1, incapacitation, and 2, deterrence. So incapacitation merely means we are just taking a group of troublemakers and getting them off the street, right? We are incapacitating them. So people that would normally be committing crimes are unable to do so because they are incapacitated. So that's an incapacitation effect. Who can explain to me how incarceration, what sort of deterrent effect might that have? How would that work?
Like other people would see that, like I guess like in a gang, like other people would see that their like other friends or members aren't there anymore because they're in jail, so that's going to deter them because they don't want to be in jail either.
Exactly. So week 3, so not next week, the week after that, I'm going to spend the entire week talking shit about deterrence theory, and I'm going to explain to you why deterrence never has an effect on the crime rate. So when we are talking about the incarceration policies, we are only referring to the incapacitation effects. Deterrence had absolutely nothing to do with this. It was simply that we took this group of people and made it impossible for them to commit crimes on the outside. I mean, they can still be doing their dirt on the prison, inside the prison, but we're talking about the nationwide crime rate, right? So when we're looking at the effect of incarceration on crime, it's simply incapacitation effects that affected the crime rate of the 90s. So since the increase in incarceration was a major policy change in the American criminal justice system in the last 3 decades of the 20th century, it's easy to assume that alone is what caused the Great American Crime Decline. There's a couple of problems with that assumption. The first one is that there were large increases in incarceration through the 70s and 80s that were not accompanied by a downturn in the crime rate. So if it was incapacitation, we would expect the Great American Crime Decline to begin long before the 90s. It shouldn't take 20 years for that to make an effect, right? The other problem with that, and you can see over here, the red is the imprisonment rate, and the other, we have motor vehicle theft is green, we've got burglary is purple, and homicide is blue. And you can see that those rates are kind of all over the place. We would think that it would trend much more simply than it does right here if it was simply incarceration. So if it was simply incarceration, the main question is, why didn't the crime rate start falling sooner, right? So we know incapacitation had an effect on the Great American Crime Decline. How large of an effect is debatable. I've actually been at a conference and seen 2 old white men almost come to blows over whose statistical model was correct. Like they were fighting over like 30 versus 35% of like how much it affected the crime rate. So that is debatable and potentially can cause fights. So all you need to know for our purposes is that incarceration did have an effect on the Great American Crime Decline, but simply through incapacitation, not through deterrence. So we're going to talk about 2 other factors that have absolutely nothing to do with criminal justice policy, right? Which is why I taught you about the euphoric fallacy. So the first one we're going to talk about is demographics. So who knows what the age crime curve is? Who wants to tell us about the age crime curve? Anyone?
Something like most people like actually around our age are more likely to commit crimes and stuff, or it's like what, 18 to 24, 26, or like that you're most likely to do something.
Yeah, exactly. So there's some people say 15 to 25, others say 18 to 24. But on average, most people are going to age into crime around 15 and be done with crime around 25, right? The age crime curve has been stable since the 1400s. It doesn't matter what year we're in. It doesn't matter what sort of economic circumstances we're in. It doesn't matter who you are as a person. It doesn't matter what part of the country or what part of the world you live in. On average, people are going to age into crime at 15 and age out at 25. That age crime curve is invariant across all social aspects, temporal periods, time periods, and any sort of other geographical experience, right? So it doesn't matter what year we're in, what part of the world you live in, or your social circumstances, most people follow that age crime curve, right? And 15 to 25 is the average. So that doesn't mean every single person when they turn 15 starts committing crimes. That means on average, most people when they start committing crimes are around the age of 15, and when they're done is about 25. So let's talk about how that might have affected the crime rate. So baby boomers. My parents are baby boomers. These were people that were born after World War II. So most of them were born in the 50s, mid 50s, maybe early 60s. But the baby boomers were a huge population. That was a lot of people that were born in that time period, right? So they would be, if you look at the people, those baby boomers, when they were born, they would be aging into crime in the 70s and the 80s when the crime rate was rising, and they'd be aging out of crime in the 90s when the crime rate went down. So this is something that is really hard to see that's happening while it's happening. This theory didn't come out until much later because you had to have all of that data and you had to have enough time pass that you were able to retroactively analyze that. So The age crime curve had, and the baby boomers, that population, that just huge group of people being born, aged into crime when the crime rate was rising and aged out of crime when it was decreasing. So that effect was huge. That probably had a larger effect than incapacitation. Again, researchers might come to blows about which one's more important. So we're not going to talk about that. We're just going to talk in the abstract, right? So demographics played a huge role. There's also one other part that I like to mention about demographics. It's very controversial, but I'm not going to not talk about it. When was Roe versus Wade passed?
In the 1970s.
When would those kids be aging into crime?
Can you say it again? I'm not sure I understand that.
So Roe versus Wade, 1974. When would those kids be aging into crime?
Oh, about 18 years later then?
Around the 90s, right?
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. That's what I'm getting at here. We have this huge group of people that couldn't have been born that would have contributed to the crime rate. They would have aged into crime in the 90s, right? So things like demographics that people don't think about that can affect the crime rate. This is why I say that crime is a social problem, right? There are so many other things that go into the crime rate that people don't consider, right? So just something as simple as demographics, people being born or not born, that would affect when they age in or out of crime. That is a huge deal that people often don't notice until retroactively they've got all that data in front of them. So the last thing that hugely affected the Great American Crime Decline was the economy. So you guys are all probably born in the 2000s, which is upsetting. So you weren't alive during the 90s, but it was a wild time in the 90s. The economy was great. The unemployment rate was dropped by about half in the 8 years after 1991. So people that might have lost a job and needed to pick up crime, that was dropped considerably. So there are all kinds of studies that show the correlation between unemployment and the crime rate. In fact, one of my previous professors was the pioneer of that in the late 1980s, when the economic turn was starting to happen. Ted Chiricos and Gordon Waldo published a bunch of studies about how the economy affects crime rates, right? But during the 90s, it wasn't just that unemployment was low, it was also that wages were rising, right? So there was a steady rise in wages from 1985 to 2000. So because unemployment was low and wages were higher, that pulls a bunch of people out of that criminal pool, right? Somebody that might have lost a job and had to turn to crime, that's not as much of an issue anymore. Or somebody that wasn't making enough money in their job and had to start hustling drugs, right, on the side. Because of the rising wages, we're not seeing that happening, right? So it seemed like the 1990s were a decade where each of these three influences were operating with maximum historical impact in a crime prevention direction. So the incapacitation effect was maximal in the 90s. The baby boomers were aging out of crime. This was a demographic blessing that was overlooked while it was happening. And economic expansion was enormous, the longest on record. So this sort of trifecta of crime preventative forces hadn't happened in the 7 decades of recorded crime trends. So the point of this is not, the point here is crime, like I said, it's a social problem. People choose to engage in crime for a myriad of reasons, and sometimes factors outside of the criminal justice policy affect the crime rate more than we know. So it's important to remember that moving forward, when we see seemingly perfect criminal justice programs or policies not having the desired effect, right? There's always stuff happening in the background that's really hard to tell. So when we move forward with this class, we're going to be talking about a lot of prison-based rehabilitation programs, and some of them work and some of them don't, right? And it's just important to understand that it's rare that if you put one person through a criminal justice related program or pass one criminal justice policy, it's going to affect every single person that's, you know, taking place in or taking part in crime, right? So this is just something that you need to remember, the euphoric fallacy, the temptation to assume that crime declines are caused by policy. I'm not saying we shouldn't pass criminal justice policy. I'm just saying we shouldn't have unrealistic expectations for it. Not every single person is going to respond to criminal justice policy or respond in the same way, right? So we just kind of need to lower our expectations about how effective, like overall, a criminal justice policy can be, because crime is a social issue and unlikely to be affected by one change. Questions? No questions? All right, let's get organized for next week. Let me pull up the class schedule. Okay. All right, so next week we're going over lecture 2, and then we're going to have our first policy brief workshop is going to be as a class, and then after that, I probably should have gone through the schedule with you guys. We have several weeks of just policy brief workshops, but usually what I do when there's not a plague is we all go to the computer lab and I just kind of go around and help everybody, but we can't do that. So what I've been doing, this is my 3rd semester teaching online. You guys are just going to schedule a one-on-one meeting with me for 30 minutes sometime during that week, and we're going to work together. So the weeks that we have policy brief workshops, we don't have class. You're just going to meet with me and we're going to work together on this. So we've got that on week 6. And then again, week 11, the week before it's due. You are more than welcome to schedule as many meetings to work on this policy brief with me as you would like. Like I said, I've had students that have standing appointments with me every week just to work on their policy brief. I'm happy to do that with you. Sometimes we might have to change like a little bit. I might have to like, you know, email you and say, hey, you know, I've got the kid today. I can't, you know, he'll be noisy in the background, or can we do it when he naps at a different time? Either way, we will work it out so that we can work together. So lecture 2, we're going to go over on the 25th and the 27th. And then on the 29th, we'll have a policy brief overview. Your first 2 quizzes are next week. I apologize. Normally we just have one a week. It's just, they only gave me 2 days this week. So what we're going to do, your first quiz is going to be on Wednesday and your second quiz will be on Friday. The first quiz will cover what we went over on lecture 1, and the second quiz will cover what we went over with lecture 2. So what I'm going to do a little bit later today, or maybe over the weekend, I'm going to create the schedule of Jeopardy. So what I'll do is email everybody and say on the 27th, 2 or 3 of you guys do not take that quiz online. And then on the morning of the 29th, the first thing that we'll do is those people will take the quiz live, right? And then the same thing, I'll say, okay, 2 of you aren't going to take the quiz after class today, and you'll take it live on the 1st. Does that make sense? Okay, so the only way that this gets really messed up is that if people don't show up or aren't in class to take that Jeopardy, to do the Jeopardy thing, because normally what I would do is just have somebody else play. But if you guys have already taken the quiz like 3 days before that, it won't work. So if you are playing Jeopardy, please make sure that you come to class and that you're on time, because it really messes with my perfect schedule. Okay. All right. So what I like to do when we're online, every Sunday I'll send an email just reminding you what we're going to do this week. So I'll definitely do that on Sunday. And I'll also email you guys this week to let you know, or over the weekend to let you know who's playing Jeopardy. Questions? No questions?
I have a question.
What's that?
Do the reading, like, is the material from the readings going to be on the quizzes or no? Is it just from the lectures?
No, it's going to be a combo of the 2. So it really depends. Like, for instance, the reading that you have, the first 2 chapters of the Mackenzie reading go hand in hand with the lecture, whereas other readings are a little bit different. Like, we'll talk about it in the lecture. Long story short, occasionally you'll have a question specifically from the reading. Does that make sense?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Yeah. But I like to give you guys the Mackenzie chapters for the first 2, because this history and overview of corrections, it's a lot of information. So I want you to read it from her as well. And the evidence-based corrections, you're going to use those strategies to do the policy brief all semester. Other questions? All right. Well, everybody have a wonderful weekend. If you need help with anything at all, or you want to schedule any meetings, just shoot me an email and we'll make it happen. All right. See you guys on Monday.
Dr. Hill,
Yes.
I actually just got confused about that last part.